Hello, welcome. This is a welcome video for the Civil War and Reconstruction class. Wanted to touch upon a few topical issues as well as some of the logistics, expectations, etc. for the class, as well as tools that I try to provide as an instructor. All right. One of the things I always kick off the Civil War class with is I discuss some of the myths that surround the American Civil War. For example, everyone in the South had slaves, and everybody supported slavery and secession. Many did not, including Robert E. Lee, who was offered a position in the Union military but went to the Confederacy simply because Virginia was his home state. Many Southerners actually had to be convinced that secession was the right step to take. We'll get into some of those specifics. But as far as everyone in the South having slaves, again, this is a significant myth. Some of the numbers: 22 Southerners owned 500 or more slaves, 2,300 owned 100 or more, 10,000 owned 50 or more. 53% of slaveholders owned more than 5 slaves. 5% of Southern people owned slaves, 20% of families owned slaves. Overall, 75% of Southern households owned no slaves. So 3/4 of Southern households owned no slaves. Another myth is the concept of North versus South, and this is very popular. As a matter of fact, there are some popular histories of the Civil War that focus on it, and even I think there's one that's called North versus South. This oversimplifies things significantly. The more accurate terminology would be Union versus Confederacy. Now, unfortunately, some of the texts that we have this term, even some of the questions posited, include this inaccurate verbiage, but Union and Confederacy are appropriate. Now consider, again, it's not as easy as North versus South. One of the things that we'll discuss when we talk about the anti-slavery movement, there was a bounty on the head of Garrison, who was, one of the leading abolitionists. His work, The Liberator, his newspaper, The Liberator, was one of the keys for the movement. But he had a bounty on his head in Boston, which was the center of the anti-slavery movement. So it's not that simple. Think about the New York draft riots, for example, against conscription and against fighting to end slavery. These were Northern workers who did not want to go to war and sacrifice themselves to end slavery. On the flip side, there were anti-slavery societies in Southern states. In short, there were pro-slavery forces in northern states, just as there were, and pro-Confederacy sources to some of the newspapers. As a matter of fact, when you read some of the editorials, quite critical of Lincoln, calling for an end to the war, even if it means continuing slavery. So there were pro-slavery, pro-Confederacy forces in northern states. There were anti-slavery and pro-union folks in southern states. So again, it's not as simple as North versus South. One last thing, and it's unfortunate that I have to point this out, but I do every term because there are a handful of students who are not cognizant of this fact. Slavery existed well before colonial North America. People had slaves way before the invention of the United States, right? We've seen slavery at every level. I shouldn't say every level, but every time in human history, every era, literally, even today, there is slavery. So a lot of times people jump to, oh my gosh, Americans are so bad they had slaves. Well, we're not the only ones. Yes, slavery was obviously terrible, but it is an institution that unfortunately has existed throughout human history. Now, getting to some of the more positive things, one of the things I focus on is the anti-slavery movement. Again, I think there's a lack of understanding of much of the detail of this. It actually, in the United States, I shouldn't say in the United States, in colonial North America, it goes back all the way to the 17th century. Religion was very much at the center of abolitionism. Quakers, for example, led the charge in many ways. But the strengthening of the movement came through churches and religious practice in the 19th century. Yes, some did use religion initially to help justify the use of African slavery, but it was much more important to the anti-slavery crowd, and it was, again, key to the development of the anti-slavery movement. Now, with regard to the compromises that we're going to talk about, because, of course, once we get to the 19th century, slavery really divides the country, and there are different ways that are looked at to try to create compromise. Many of these compromises regarding slavery were about political power, not necessarily about morality. For example, the Missouri Compromise, one of the major compromises that many believed would stave off any kind of civil war or conflict. It was not about preventing slavery in Missouri for necessarily. It was about maintaining a balance between pro and anti-slavery states in Congress. Now, another thing is that the war was not initially about ending slavery, right? Initially, it was about preserving the Union. And I point to a letter that Abraham Lincoln wrote to Horace Greeley in 1862. Greeley is a major publisher at the time. And this bears mention for a few reasons. Now, again, the war is not initially about ending slavery. This would change. This is one of the reasons the Emancipation Proclamation is so important, because it gave purpose to the war. Prior, many felt simply that fighting to save the Union was a little bit vague. They felt little connection to the war. And research has shown, and in fact, one of the essays that we will read this term focuses on how this changed. But those who fought recognized that this was a war about slavery much earlier than politicians did, and that they recognized the only way to truly make progress was to make the war about slavery. Now, the first people to recognize this were, not surprisingly, slaves, but then those who fought in the war, again on the Union side, recognized this as well. And so this would change the purpose of the war again at the beginning of 1863 and make a marked difference. But getting back to this letter that Lincoln wrote, and it's important for a handful of reasons. I'm just going to read one paragraph. My paramount object in the struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, it's a quote again, I do because I believe it helps to save this Union, and what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us first and foremost, Lincoln was a pragmatist, right? He recognized some things that he could do, and he recognized things that he couldn't do. And I think one of the keys, one of the things that you will really recognize in this class, and I know I've had other students tell me, Lincoln was far from perfect, right? And he was somewhat dictatorial when he was president. We'll get to that down the road. There are many layers to Lincoln that many are not cognizant of. And some have questioned Lincoln's sincerity in wanting to end slavery. Now, his ideas certainly evolved over time. We cannot dispute this, really. But as some scholars have shown, including Alan Guelzo, who has an essay that we will read this term, specifically about Lincoln and his sincerity regarding slavery. But what many scholars have shown is that Lincoln truly did want to end the peculiar institution. He may not have attacked it immediately, but he was a pragmatic leader who knew he had to find the right time to change the purpose of the war. And even prior to the war, you'll notice that Lincoln never states that he will end slavery. He specifically states he will not touch slavery when he is running for president, because he realizes if he does say that, first of all, he probably won't get elected. There are many things that will probably happen, but he recognizes this. He's somewhat gradualist in this, I understand. Some might say he was a little too patient. But again, recognizing Lincoln's political wit, if you will, we see that his ideas did change over time. He was sincere about ending slavery. And lest we forget, he literally gave his life to end slavery. Now, those are some of the themes, some of the topics, some of the general ideas that we'll cover. I want to get to some of the logistics of the class, some of the expectations. There are readings, obviously, every week. History is a very reading and writing intensive subject, but the readings and their importance are significant. Each week there is at least one extra essay written by an historian that is included in the Major Problems book. So you've got the McPherson book, which is somewhat of a textbook, if you will. That one will cover the first, I think it's 9 weeks. We'll read a few chapters from that. And it kind of follows the story of the Civil War, very detailed fashion. But the Major Problems book gets into more of the details. Now, these are so essential for those who truly want to learn about the war. And at least one question each week will focus on the essay or essays from the book that are required for that week. I ask that everyone answer at least one of those during the term because, again, these really get to the nuts and bolts of the Civil War. If you truly want to understand the Civil War, you will incorporate those essays and put them into a larger whole. Some of the things that this will cover, of course, origins of the conflict, specific campaigns, their impact, the role of women on both sides of the war, the ideas of the men who fought, the actions and ideas of African Americans before and after the Emancipation Proclamation, the intricacies of Reconstruction. These are the details that make the study of history so interesting and help us truly understand the war, Reconstruction, and its impact. Now, one other thing is I post video lectures each week. For some, there are multiple lectures, but to help with more of the details that the text may not be able to get into. Now, these can be found in 2 places, and they're the same lectures. In announcements for that week, so week 2 announcements, you'll have a couple video lectures in there. Similarly, in the weekly assignment section, I will post links to those same lectures. So please make sure to read these. Now, these are not required necessarily, but they do provide important information that will help with the course. And again, more importantly, will help you more fully understand the conflict and its aftermath. Most of the video lectures might be 15, 20 minutes long if you are a little bit longer, but I get into a lot of different things. Again, the practice of African slavery on the North American continent, the history of that, the history of the anti-slavery movement, and then I will have the run-up to the Civil War, which goes through those compromises I mentioned earlier, and then I'll have a couple videos on each year of the war because there's a lot going on within those. And then, of course, the final 3, one is on 1865 and the assassination of Lincoln, and then 2 on Reconstruction. So again, these will be posted in a couple areas, and please, if you have questions or concerns or have any issues accessing them, please let me know. Now, as far as the papers, I mentioned the readings. You'll have readings each week and then weekly discussion board assignments. There are 2 papers in this class. Both are historiographical essays. Now, if you haven't done a historiographical essay, I provide instructions in the toolbox. There are instructions for the assignment, and then I'm going to get to something a little bit later that I'm hoping that will help students as well. But in the toolbox, again, on the left side of the screen, you'll see the toolbox, and inside that are specifics about each paper, but also some additional things that I provide. One helps further explain what a historiography is and how to create one. One document covers just general tips for good writing, another defines what constitutes a scholarly source, and yet another on what a primary source is. Now, historiographical essays use only secondary sources. They do not use primary sources. Historiographical essays are about understanding how historians have analyzed an issue in the past. Again, the instructions are there. I won't burden you with that right now. But good sources are absolutely integral for these assignments and really for any study at this level. Now, I have a reputation for being a stickler for good sources, and that's fine. This is a 300-level college class. There should be no sources ending in pedia. There should be no generic websites like biography.com or history.com. There should be no use of any source unless it is written by an historian. For example, a business magazine is not going to help understand history. Historians have different methods and different goals from other studies. Many of these historians that we will study this term have spent decades studying these issues. Short YouTube videos by a history buff or blogs by somebody who just learned about an issue don't cut it. Proper source material is one of the lessons I hope you do take from this course. Now, per previous student feedback in our courses, I would like to actually do a Zoom meeting or 2 this term. Possibly more than that. I completely understand we all have different schedules. Not everyone will be able to attend, but I think that these would be especially helpful with regard to the papers, for one thing. I will send out some emails to garner a response in a couple weeks after the term starts. Maybe we could have maybe 2 Zoom meetings before the midterm, maybe a couple Zoom meetings before the final paper. My thought is if we have 2 covering the same issue, this will give students a better opportunity to engage or be part of the Zoom meetings. We can have them at different times, etc. Again, these will not be mandatory, and I will do my best to make sure as many students as possible, or ideally all students, are able to get involved. But I think this is a nice thing so that we can kind of connect face to face, which I think makes an online class better. But also it gives you a chance to ask me questions directly, especially as we get into these papers. If you have any, there are going to be questions inevitably. And this will give you a chance to ask those directly and for me to answer those immediately. So now a few other tips. Please make sure to read your Bellevue email. All emails default to this address. This is the best way to communicate in an online class, and I will send emails periodically, both to the whole class and to individuals. So please make sure you are checking that regularly or have it forwarded to a personal address. I would recommend avoiding the use of artificial intelligence altogether, though in theory, if you use it, you are to cite it accordingly. The bottom line, how we look at it, do not use AI to write your papers. And yes, I see this every term. And if you do it, I will probably notice. You are spending a lot of money for these classes. Why avoid the learning? Do the work. Please make sure to read through the syllabus carefully. Please feel free to contact me with any questions. Some will inevitably come up. Email me is the best way to communicate. So please read through that syllabus thoroughly so you understand the requirements, the expectations, etc. Now, last little bit here. History is complex. It is nuanced. It is not linear. It is not simple, and it can be ugly. Those in the media, or even worse, the entertainment industry, do not realize this. They often portray things in a less than accurate Manichaean light. Things are not that simple. Things are not black and white. My hope is this class helps to foster understanding of the Civil War, of Reconstruction, and of this era of history as a whole, recognizing these complexities in an effort to render an understanding of the larger whole. Again, history is not simple. It is very complex, and the sooner that we understand and recognize this and incorporate that into our studies, the better off we will be. Thank you for listening. And I look forward to working with each of you this term. Civil War is a great class, and it is really one of the most important events in our nation's history as far as defining us.